Shalom. The Balfour Declaration, 1917, of Israel didn't exist. The Jews had lived in the land of Israel since biblical times, since Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who gave rise to the Hebrew nations. They had given forth 12 tribes. These 12 tribes divided into two sections. The northern tribes, the 10 tribes, were in the north. The southern tribes were in the south. The southern tribes comprised the southern tribes were the tribes of Judah, Benjamin, Levi, and minority representatives of the other tribes. They had the kingdom of Judah. They were known as Jews. That's where the Jews come from. The present-day Jewish people come from the southern kingdom of Judah. The northern kingdom was known as the kingdom of Israel, and it comprised 10 tribes. And these 10 tribes were conquered by the Assyrians, taken into exile. And in their places of exile, they assimilated to the ways of the nations around them. And they'd already began to go down, to deteriorate, to degenerate whilst they were still in their homeland. And even more so after their time of exile, they became like the Gentiles. They moved with the Gentiles, they migrated. Eventually they recoalesced in Western Europe. They created nations of Western Europe. And amongst the nations they created was the nation of Britain, the British Isles. And in the British Isles, there were descendants of the 10 tribes of Israel. And amongst those tribes in that area, the tribes of Joseph, Ephraim, and Manasseh were predominant. So Britain as a tribal entity is recognizable as Joseph, the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, especially Ephraim. Then they fought wars, and eventually they came to the First World War. Between 1914 and 1918, the First World War was fought. And at that time, the land of Israel, just before the First World War, there were about 45,000 Jews. And the Jews had been, as we said, they'd been in the land of Israel, along with their brothers. And their brothers, the 10 tribes, were exiled by the Assyrians. The Jews were also exiled somewhat later by the Babylonians. But they came back. They came back from Babylon, whereas the 10 tribes did not come back. They came back, and at first there was only a trickle, only a small number of them, but eventually they grew to be quite a power, quite an entity, quite a force in the region. And they were conquered by the Romans, and then they fought against the Romans, and the Romans defeated them and drove them out, and they were scattered all over the Roman Empire and in other areas. And they were forbidden eventually from living in the land. But nevertheless they did. Some of them came back. They kept coming back over the centuries, and trying to revive something of what they previously had. And now and again they were partially successful, but not often. And that's the way it continued down through the centuries. Small numbers of Jews living in the land, and they're surrounded by foreigners, by Gentiles, by strangers, other peoples. Eventually most of these other peoples received the Arab culture. They spoke the Arab language. And they had the Islamic religion, or the Christian religion. One time there were many Christians in the region of Palestine, but the Muslims drove them away, and so you have not got that many of them left. But at one stage there were quite a few of them. At all events, that is what happened, and whereas the Jews are scattered all over the earth, especially in Europe. In Europe, they suffered from attacks, pogroms, and persecutions. These persecutions began to get even worse than they previously had. In Russia especially was very bad in the 1800s. So some Jews saw a solution in reviving Jewish existence in the Holy Land. So they began to go back, coming back to the land. In the 1700s, religious Jews came. In the 1800s, secular Jews, or alongside religious Jews, also alongside religious Jews from Yemen, and some from North Africa. And as we said, just before the First World War, there were about 40,000 Jews in the area. During the First World War, many Jews left. The few Jews that were there, many of them left. They were exiled, or they fled, or they suffered from plagues, from starvation. And by the time the war ended, there were only about 15,000 of them in the area. Just before the end of towards the end of the war, the First World War, the British soldiers conquered the area in 1917. As December 1917, they took Jerusalem. But a month before then, the British government had issued the Balfour Declaration. A Balfour Declaration. Balfour Declaration is considered the basis for the modern state of Israel in certain ways. It was published as a letter. It's actually a letter from the member of the British cabinet, the British government, the Foreign Secretary, Arthur Balfour, in the government headed by Lord George from Wales. And Balfour sent this letter to Lord Rothschild, who was an important Jew, a member of the Jewish community, and he received a letter from Balfour, and this letter said that His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and we use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. You should note that this talks about the establishment in Palestine of a national home. The original draft intention had been to the establishment of Palestine as a national home. So this was changed. This was changed. It was also the caveat concerning the rights not to prejudice the rights of other peoples living in the area was also an addition to the original intention. But all events, how it came out is how it was. And this Balfour Declaration was to be taken as a kind of a statement of principles by which should be aimed at and by which things should be conducted. As a result of the Balfour Declaration, Jewish communities throughout the world increased their support for Zionism, for the Zionist movement. It led to the emergence of the State of Israel, and also it is considered the principal cause of the Israel-Palestine conflict. About a month after the Balfour Declaration had been issued, towards the end of 1917, in December, the British forces, amongst whom the Anzacs, Australia and New Zealand Army Corps were very important, and these British forces had conquered Jerusalem. And after that, they took over rule of the country. At first, the first land was ruled by British military officers, military administrators. And in June 1920, these military men were replaced by a civil administration headed by Herbert Samuel. Herbert Samuel was a Jew, and he was a committed Zionist. And from then on, things went ahead. From 15,000 or less in 1917, under British administration, with ups and downs and problems and all kinds of stories and crises, the population of Palestine increased from 15,000 to more than 600,000. And these 600,000 in 1948, they had an organisation, they had a an infrastructure, they had factories, they had industries, they had an army, and they defeated the surrounding Arab nations who came in, invaded, and tried to destroy them. And all of this had been set up and put into practice with the help, under the protection and the assistance of the British administration. So it was quite an achievement. The question arises, why did the British do this? What did they have in it? What was it for them? Why were they this way inclined? I believe that many of the British are sent to the lost tribes of Israel. So subconsciously, this may have been a factor. But very few of the British people are aware of this. And even those who do know about it or believe in it, they do not appreciate the Jews so much. But nevertheless, one can say that subconsciously, spiritually even, it was a motivating cause, something that had to be done, and they had to do it. For quite some time, ever since the 1600s. The 1600s, there were already groups and individuals in England who were speaking of creating in Palestine, creating in the Holy Land, a Jewish kingdom. And some of these groups, perhaps most of them at the beginning, they said they should have a Jewish kingdom, and this should be a prelude to converting the Jews to Christianity. And throughout the history of Zionism, of Gentile Zionism, of Gentiles helping the Jews and supporting the state of Israel, this has been a motivation. They want to convert the Jews to Christianity. In addition to wanting to convert the Jews to Christianity, they're also concerned for the Jewish welfare. They wanted to see a Jewish state in the area for its own sake. And some of them did not want to convert the Jews to Christianity. And even those who did, most of them did not make it an unconditional aim. It was as if the cherry in the pie, something that could come later, something they would wish for everyone, something that for religious reasons they had to advocate. But it wasn't necessarily what they wanted. Or if they did want it, they did not necessarily want it so strongly as one should suppose. Many of them believed in the Jewish people, and they appreciated the Jewish religion, and they saw the need for this to continue and to even become stronger. So you had all different pressures, all different influences and drives, and they all came together. We ourselves are Orthodox Jews, even ultra-Orthodox Jews, or on the fringes of ultra-Orthodoxy, one could say. We believe in Judaism. We are against Jews converted to Christianity, and we also are not in favour of Gentiles on the whole becoming Jewish. That each person, each group, of these separate groups of Israelites have their own pathway to tread, their own journey to go along, to follow through. And when the Messiah comes, may come soon, he will resolve all of these issues one way or the other. And we can only believe and do the best we can under these circumstances we find ourselves in. It's also worth mentioning that many of the Christian Zionists, or those who believe that the Jewish people should have their own country in the Holy Land, that quite a few of them also believed that the British were descended from lost tribes. People of significance who held this belief include Colonel John Henry Patterson, Colonel Richard Meinzerhagen, and Order Wingate. All of these were military people of some note and significance. Ask the question, what gave Britain the right to take the country of one people, that is Palestine, and give it to another people, that is the Jews? What gave them the right, and why should they have done it? So there are different reasons for this. Several reasons that all came together at the one time and all of which have pertinence of their own. Amongst these reasons, we find the simple question of room. At the beginning, Palestine was underdeveloped, underpopulated at that time, and there was plenty of room in the country for both Jews and Arabs to get along, and they could bring in the Jews and develop the land, and also the Arabs would benefit. And theoretically that might have been a possibility, but it was not to work out, it was not to be. So there was a conflict, and the conflict resulted in many Palestinians fleeing and leaving as refugees, going to other countries, going to Jordan, going to Lebanon, going to Syria and elsewhere, and also going to what became the West Bank. And these Palestinians, refugees, they fled, or they left, or they were encouraged to leave. But their numbers were less than the number of Jews in Arab countries such as Yemen, Libya, Iraq, who also were forced to leave their places of origin, which they had lived in for centuries, and to come to Israel. So in a de facto sense, there was an exchange of populations. And so retroactively, there was a certain justification for the Jews coming in the first place, because there's such a thing in history that certain events have to happen some way or other, and this is the way it happened. The transference of populations had to take place, so the Jews came in first, and also they came in later. So that is one point. Another point is that belief in the Bible. People will read the Bible. They feel as if the Spirit of God Almighty is communicating with them in some sense. And the impression from the Bible, reading the Bible, is that God Almighty wants the Jews to return and live in the land. And many people in Britain at that time did read the Bible, who had grown up in the households where the Bible was read. It was part of the culture, part of the general belief at that time. Also, the British had a history of their own, of wishing to restore the Jews to their land. Important people for centuries had been adherents of such a belief. With the passing of time, more and more people came around to this way of thinking. Also amongst the British and amongst the Americans and amongst the French, there were those who wanted to find a territorial solution to the Jewish refugee problem. The Jews in Europe, the Jews in North Africa, the Jews in Iran. Wherever there were large concentrations of Jews, they were persecuted. And now and again, the persecutions would get worse. People would be killed, wounded, assaulted, humiliated, rendered homeless, with nowhere to go, and there would be a problem to where to send them to. Not every place wanted to accept them. In some cases, not every place was able to accept them. There were periods of scarcity, of poverty, of lack of progress. And so there would be no place for these Jews, these victims of persecution, to go to. So every now and again, solutions had been sought for this. And the idea was to find some place where the Jews could settle in, and therefore they would not need to be refugees elsewhere where they were not wanted. And suggestions and even plans and practical implementations of these plans were begun in different areas. They included Western Australia, included El Arish in Egyptian Sinai to the southwest of Palestine, included areas in South America, in Alaska, in East Africa, and so on. So Palestine turned out to be the best option available. It was available. The British had conquered it. They could do with it what they wanted. Previously it had belonged to the Ottoman Empire, but the Ottoman Empire was now finished, ended. It was going to be broken up into little pieces. And everyone was grabbing one portion of it or the other. So the British took the one portion. That happened to be the Holy Land. And it was the best option available for a Jewish territory. And it was the only place most Jews wanted to go to. And it was suitable. So that is another reason why Palestine was chosen. Also, the geopolitical reality placed a value on that area. It was close to Egypt, close to the Suez Canal. It was close to reserves of petroleum, of other resources. It was a strategically placed region at the junction of the continents of Europe, of Asia and Africa. The 10 tribes had gone to Northern Europe. They had created their countries, the UK, the USA, Switzerland, Scandinavian countries and so on. And they had upgraded themselves, they had evolved, they had elevated themselves, they had become civilized and progressive and enlightened. And they radiated these new approaches to humanity, to humanism throughout the earth. They had elevated all of mankind, and that was one of the reasons why they had become as they had become, why they lost consciousness of their ancestry, why they were exiled, and why they went down to where they went and then ever evolved upwards. That was one of the reasons for them, having been exiled and losing their identity in the first place. Rabbinical sources, the 10 tribes, or sometimes the 10 tribes, or sometimes the Mashiach ben Yosef, that is the Messiah, son of Joseph, who actually represents the 10 tribes, as well as being the head of them, he represents them, are destined to go to the Jews and help the Jews come back to the land of Israel, and to help build it up, whilst remaining separate until the end times, until the final reunion between the two halves of the Israelite nation, as indicated in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 37, with the two sticks coming together and reunion and being one stick. British, by doing what they did, were fulfilling this prophecy and these traditions. Explains it. That is the whole explanation. In other words, we have a divine providence. God Almighty rules the world. He decides how things will come about. He even inspires prophets and wise men to write down indications as to what will be in the future. And this is what had been written down, and this is what came about. So we should take this to heart. And what happened in history can also happen to us. So too we pray that God Almighty will guide us and help us and show us what we should do. And this is something that is going on today before